True story. I missed the Chito Vera vs Dominick Cruz fight, and I only caught the climax, and it was not pretty. So I wasn't going to cover this fight, but this victory piqued my interest because I really wanted to know how this fight played out leading up to that knockout. I knew Chito Vera won, but what was the process for getting there? For a while now, Vera has been racking up some pretty impressive wins, so this put him on my radar to find out how he did in this fight. Was this a fight where he stylistically dominated Cruz? Was it a back and forth chess match? Or was it something else? While the outcome of this fight is a breathtaking feat, the process to getting there is what made me make this video today. The most important thing about this fight is that it reveals a shocking truth, so let's get into those details. I've always been interested in seeing how a fighter gets defeated, so when I look at this story, at one point Dominick Cruz, he dominated the bantamweight division for a long time, and it was always a frustrating challenge because Cruz is a very evasive fighter and no one could quite figure him out. It wasn't until his defeats that we started to see really interesting things take place, and along these defeats, every fight told an interesting story. We saw glimpses of how fighters can exploit aspects of his notorious fighting style. You see, over the years, fighters started to figure him out, so Cruz eventually made adjustments, and it's been pretty fascinating to see how things played out. For example, Cruz used to heavily rely on his infamous feinting technique that he refers to as a slide. It's a feint where he uses a hop at an angle to get reactions and to create angles by sliding off. And if the opponent bites on his feints, he could easily retreat back and punish them for it. There's a lot of applications for this specific feint. But sure enough, Henry Cejudo and Cody Garbrandt found ways to exploit this specific technique. If you want to know more about the specifics of how the feint works or how it was countered, you can always visit my old video on Dominick Cruz's fighting style and the adjustments that he's made. The big takeaway is that Cruz had to make a lot of adjustments as people started figuring things out. As a result, he stopped using his feint style almost entirely. To me, this was a fascinating part about his evolution because this was a very commonly used feint technique he almost always used in his style, but now it's nearly non-existent. This is why I wanted to see how Vera vs Cruz played out, to see if there were any more changes that happened and what Vera did to find success. As I studied the fight between Chito Vera and Dominick Cruz, I wanted to see how Vera managed to defeat Cruz. Was there something Vera figured out that stifled Cruz's fighting style? Was there some process to breaking Cruz down? And at the end, I was left amused, but I was also left somewhat unsatisfied. Cruz had used tactics that would work quite often, but what really got him in trouble was some of his old habits. The fight overall was a bit strange, and the story to me was a little bit unsettling. Dominick Cruz is a very high pressure fighter. He typically overloads his opponent with a lot of feints and always presses forward with all kinds of activity. Even to Chito Vera's own admission, he stated that this was one of the hardest fights, and after studying the fight, I can see why. Cruz used a variety of tactics to land his offense. In the past, Cruz was more of a boxing-centric fighter, but has actually adapted more weapons into his game. He uses kicks a lot more, and he builds up certain openings with those kicks. Cruz would throw body kicks and head kicks, and then he would use them to build his boxing entries. For example, after establishing the threat of a kick, Cruz would fake his kicks and then transition into boxing entries. Cruz would use his kicks to destroy Vera's stance and punish him when he was vulnerable. So in these instances, you'll notice that as Cruz disrupts Vera's stance, he's in no good position to fire back until his feet are back in order, and this gave Cruz a chance to fire his attacks. This tactic was something Cruz was very consistently able to implement throughout this fight. And when Vera would try to kick Cruz's legs or his body, Cruz made sure to deter it by catching his legs and using them for takedown opportunities. Overall, Cruz made sure to have some kind of answer to many of the offensive attempts Vera would try. Cruz threw all sorts of attacks and gave various looks to overload Vera's senses. There were even times where Cruz would fake takedowns just to create scrambles so that he could attempt to attack off of them. You see Cruz use a lot of his signature craft like his combo where he throws his power shot, weaves under to catch him with a hook. And you'll see that as Cruz throws his power shot, he's gonna weave under the opponent's line of fire and then fire his hook coming out the other way. We also saw some new additions to his offensive tools. One of the things I found interesting was Cruz's use of the step over. This is a technique where you throw a power shot while stepping over and using your feet to go into a different stance and then following up with a lead hook. Let's break it down. Here as Cruz does his power shot, he's going to take his head outside of Chito's lead leg. This is outside Chito's effective striking zone, and then he transitions up to another lead hook follow-up. You're also going to notice that when Cruz hits this position, this forces Chito to switch his stance in order to realign himself with Cruz. Here Cruz does his power shot moving outside of Chito's lead leg into more defensive position. He does a step over and then follows up with a lead hook. This forces Chito to change his position. It's a useful way of closing that gap, and it was also a very useful technique that Alexander Volkanovski used to score against Max Holloway. The jab is one of the most common attacks in combat sports. It's an important tool to have, so it would make sense to have an effective counter for it. This is where the pull counter comes in. I created a detailed guide that may help you land this better by introducing you to different concepts when fighting. These are principles that help me out, so they may be useful to you too. For the time being, you can access this by subscribing to my newsletter on my website. Links are in the description. Don't forget to hit that like and that bell icon if you like this video. Alright, let's get back to the video. Cruz would regularly go to the body quite often. Those shots would pay off too because by going to the body, it often opens up the head for other shots. So in some occasions, you would see Cruz fake low to the body and then fire his shots to the head. So at this point, you probably noticed that Cruz was able to not only execute his tactics, he could replicate them quite frequently. When it came down to Vera's approach, what I found is that he had a lot of troubles trying to establish some avenue of tactics where he can consistently exploit against Cruz. There was one particular thing that did pay off, but we'll get to that later in the video. To give you a more complete picture of how this fight played out, Vera had a lot of troubles establishing anything consistent. Cruz threw out a lot of fakes, and it made it very hard for Vera to get his offense going. Cruz threw so many fakes and he showed so many threats, and it just caused Vera to return back into playing into a defensive rhythm quite often. To make things worse, Cruz is notoriously known for always using his footwork and evasion to deny the opponent a chance to score their shots. So when Vera did attempt to press forward, it would often result in Cruz doing Cruz things and evading those shots. Even when Cruz came into attack, countering him proved to be difficult since Cruz doesn't typically like staying in the pocket to exchange. One of Cruz's favorite things to do is just go in and throw his offense and escape laterally to avoid retaliation. And this is what makes Cruz a very hard fighter to counterpunch in the first place. This added more frustration to Vera's ability to counter Cruz. For the flow of the fight, you had Cruz who was able to replicate his offensive tactics often. And this is the strangest part of the story to me because as consistent as Cruz was, Vera was more effective, albeit less consistent when it came to who landed the more meaningful shots. Even though Cruz could land his shots frequently, they weren't as impactful as the shots landed by Vera. When Vera did land his shots, they happened to be very good shots that would drop Cruz. These shots were very meaningful in the eyes of the judges, so as consistent as Cruz could be tactically, this is just a situation where a nice clean knockdown from Vera was enough to raise Cruz's efforts to win the round. I watched Vera's habits very closely to see if I could observe a common theme or a common tactical approach he was using to score those knockdowns, but I didn't seem to see much of a common trend between those knockdowns. When we look at the nature of those knockdowns, they were very unique and always specific to the situation. The first account was when Vera would knock down Cruz countering his kick attempt. The second knockdown came from Vera walking down Cruz using his double jab and then scoring the cross to get the knockdown. The third situation was where Vera would time a stepping jab to intercept Cruz coming in. Across all three significant shots, these were all unique situations that wouldn't be typically replicated again through some kind of tactical execution. Regardless, Vera earned those knockdowns very handily, but the nature of this fight had me a bit unsatisfied. There weren't many particular tactics Vera could replicate on a regular basis to score these shots. This was a case where it didn't really matter because those knockdowns still did its job. This was a fight where all that was needed was Vera to remain patient and weather Cruz's storm of feints and offense. What really proved to be effective was exploiting Cruz's habits with kicks. Early on, Vera did a good job of reading some of Cruz's habits to set this up. The final knockdown highlights a very glaring issue with Dominick Cruz's habits, and this issue dates very far back. In the earlier days of Cruz's UFC run, most of his opponents were headhunters who would typically rely on their hands to score shots. Cruz relied a lot on lateral movement as a way to deny them the ability to box him up. Lateral movement tends to be very effective because opponents advancing in a straight line will have a very hard time making sharp turns. As a result, Cruz utilizes various movements to move laterally. But there's an issue with this. As the division grew, more advanced strikers entered the competition. When Cruz moves laterally, he has a very strong tendency to drop his hands in the process. This leaves him very vulnerable to head kicks. This has always been an issue for Cruz. In fact, if you followed my work since my blogging days, we talked about a potential exploit that fighters could use to take advantage of this habit leading up to his fight with TJ Dillashaw. When his fight with TJ played out, some of those habits came into play. As TJ came in, he would draw Cruz into using his lateral movement, and he would exploit Cruz's habit of dropping his hands. As a result, TJ would land nice clean head kicks in the process. Fast forward today, some of those defensive habits still exist, and in his fight with Vera, these habits finally took its toll. Early on, Vera seemed to be aware of Cruz's habits of moving laterally with his head exposed. You could see that as Vera strikes, he noticed that Cruz moves laterally in a sharp direction. Knowing this, Vera threw his shot to bait the lateral movement again, and then he used that chance to fire a head kick. What's also brilliant here is that Cruz only has the ability to move laterally in one direction with the cage obstructing one side, so Vera did a good job isolating the head to move into his kicking range. Later down the line towards the end of the final sequence, as Cruz came in, Vera pumped his shot again and baited Cruz to exit laterally, and then this time Vera caught the head and managed to knock Cruz out. What makes this even more dangerous is that Vera actually has very long legs for his body proportions. And fun fact, his legs are actually longer than the former heavyweight champ Stipe Miocic. But long story short, it could be very dangerous attempting to move away with head movement against a fighter with long legs. They could reach you on the way out. Now that the fight concluded, there's one big question that I have on my mind about Dominick Cruz. Knowing the glaring issue about his lateral movement, what does Cruz do to address this? Lateral movement is such an integral part of his defensive style, and to throw it out at this point of his career could be a big ask. This isn't to suggest that lateral movement or head movement can't be used in MMA. In fact, a lot of fighters can make good use of this very successfully. It's effective and very applicable when used under the right conditions. Cruz can still be evasive, and he's shown the ability to be defensively sound even to kicks while moving. Regardless of Dominick Cruz's resolve, I believe the most interesting part of the story is the adjustments that he makes moving forward. And as for Vera, I believe there's still more to his story, and I'm looking forward to seeing what else he could do against other opponents. So even though Dominick Cruz was very consistent in this fight, it also shows that you don't always have to be the most consistent one to pull off the win.